Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of The Grappler's Dilemma. I'm Cody.
And I'm Aaron.
How are you doing tonight, Aaron?
Doing well. Weekend was really good. On Friday, I showed up to class, and there were 4 people there. Darian was teaching, and it was one new guy who'd been there for like 3 classes, and then a younger guy who's been with us for a while. And it was, sometimes I show up to training, and this is not to gripe or anything like that, but you kind of hope that there's some killers in there so you can kind of get that work in. But I actually walked away from the session feeling like I got some valuable things out of, working with less experienced people. Like, it was kind of a different perspective because it was such an abnormal training atmosphere that, I don't know, I came away with some insights. One of the new guys that showed up was like, a 6'1" college freshman. He had wrestled a little bit in, I don't know if it was junior high or high school, but was just...
Sounds like easy work.
Yeah, something like that. He was totally stacked, dude. Just like strong. And he would grab wrist control, and it was hard to break. And you have that realization. This will be right on topic for what we want to talk about tonight. But I had those moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, I have this purple belt, been doing this for this long. Why? But still, the fact that this guy is just strong and athletic makes him a problem to deal with. Yeah, physics. He's still a problem to deal with because I feel like it's easy with this stuff to get caught in that, well, I have my purple belt now, or I've been training for 4 years. I should be able to mop up this guy who has 3 days of training.
Yeah.
And so when you get caught working for position or working for a submission on a new guy, it can be kind of humbling. Yeah, maybe kind of humbling, frustrating. Yeah, illuminating is a good word. Very illuminating.
Well, very, very relevant.
Yeah.
I had a good week, but I have not trained in a week, and I sort of feel the itch. Like I was in Seattle yesterday, and I was just walking the streets, and like you start to get into like Terminator mode, where you're just like analyzing everybody and like seeing opening for underhooks and osotogari.
Yeah. And in Seattle, you see people that you don't necessarily want to grapple. Right?
That's true.
Is the other side of that? Well, why haven't you been making training?
Just was busy in the evenings. Just had
that's fair.
Had various whatever
life happens.
Obligations. Yeah. Honestly, so I know we are both competing in a month, and so it's probably I like need to make up for that mat time. But it is nice to like get a week off every now and then. You do feel a lot better.
Physically, I feel better. But I feel like mentally, my brain is telling me like you need to get on the mats because you have a competition coming up.
Yeah.
But I think that like even I don't know how you tend to prep for competition. It's been a while since you competed, right?
Yes.
So like. For me, that week leading up, you try to kind of slow down a little bit. That's the hardest week for me because in my, because
you feel like you could have done more.
Yeah, you feel like and so you're trying to play catch up, but it's like
you're like, well, what if I end up in this position? Yeah, and practice this.
It's detrimental. And then the last tournament, was I think it was my most like successful tournament. I only got second place, but it felt like my best showing. And you have that. I gotta realize, like, you just have what you have, right? That whatever you're doing for that month, maybe when it comes to like, cardio and stuff, that's helpful. But you're not gonna completely change your quality of jiu-jitsu over a 30-day period. That's gonna significantly impact that tournament. I don't think.
Yeah. I agree. I've fallen to that where I'm like, what if, this latest sequence or like technique that I've been wanting to drill, like what if that ends up like being the turning point in a match, and like if I don't rep it out 10 times,
if I don't learn worm guard right now, I'm screwed. No, I totally understand that.
That all sort of ties into the topic of the show today, which is about how do I get better at jiu-jitsu. And I'll preface this again. I've sort of touched on this in the first episode. Really, neither of us should be looked at as an authority. Where if like if I had gotten a black belt in like 4 years, then you could be like I could be like, uh, here are my secrets to how I got better or I got good so fast or whatever. But really we've been around the game for a while, and we're normal guys that train jiu-jitsu like a lot of you, and so we're just gonna sort of talk about our experiences, but
like
our
hobbyist competitors,
yeah,
not professional level,
yeah,
right? I think it's an okay way to describe it.
So this topic was inspired by this recent debate between, I'm gonna probably mess up the name, Dan Menosoyu, Big Dan, who's one of Dan.
I didn't know what his last name was. Yeah.
And Greg Soders, who is getting a lot of attention lately over what he calls the ecological approach to jiu-jitsu. And so initially I wanted to weigh in on the debate, but I think both of us, after a fair amount of research, realized we're not really qualified to talk about it.
Well, literally hours of videos.
Yeah.
And it was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands.
Yeah.
Like, it was just, okay, well, this is why they're talking about things like invariables or constraint-based learning and all stuff that was very scientific. And I found out, it took me like 3 different interviews before I realized that what he was talking about wasn't something specific to jiu-jitsu. It was literally like a book about adult learning.
Yes.
But it took me so long to understand that. So some of the verbiage and stuff, I was like, well, why would you even talk about it like that? It's so confusing.
Well, anyway, like I said, we kind of realized that we're maybe not the best people at the moment to weigh in on that, although I do want to touch upon it, but it just sort of leads to a bigger question or just issue or frustration that I think a lot of people who train jiu-jitsu have, which is, how do I get better? Or should I be drilling more? Should I be rolling more? Should I be rolling less? Should I be lifting weights or cross training something?
Well, we have all these heuristics,
etc.
Heuristics in jiu-jitsu, right? Like, drillers make killers, or that's one, or like, no, don't rely on your strength. And a lot of the time, it's like, if you take a closer analysis at some of that stuff, it's like, well, that's not necessarily, like, that's not the whole picture, which I guess is the nature of a heuristic saying. But
well, what I just realized from thinking about this is it's really hard to make a definitive, for me at least, it seems like it's hard to make a definitive statement about anything, like with regards to this question, which is sort of similar in jiu-jitsu. It's like, they say in jiu-jitsu the answer is always, it depends.
Yeah.
And it's like, and beginners are always sort of, they're trying to look, because they're like kind of overwhelmed, so they're like, oh, so I should always be looking for underhooks, right? And it's like, well, it depends. Or like or never cross your feet when you do an armbar.
Sure.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just it's sort of an amusing side note. It's similar to the training questions. Like, I don't know that we can say for sure that there is 100% better way, this way or that way of training.
Well, okay, so just as far as, we won't stay on this talk for too long, but the meta of the discussion, I'm curious to what you would say is, like, what was your initial impression of it when you're, like, listening to these guys talk?
Of the debate.
We'll say of the debate, or even of the ecological system of training.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say if anybody's interested and hasn't listened to the debate, I would recommend not listening to the debate. I found it fairly frustrating and
antagonistic,
unproductive.
Yeah.
I don't think that either actually Tom DeBlas was on the call for a little bit also, on the sort of drilling side of the debate. And I don't think that either Tom or Dan were making enough of an effort to understand the other side of the debate, and sometimes they would ask what I thought were good questions, but then they would cut off Greg like before he was finished giving an answer. But then on the other side, I thought Greg did a very poor job of like it was summed up by a YouTube comment that I read that said, "I've listened to this for 2 hours and I still could not tell you what the ecological approach is."
Yeah.
And so I felt like, also, I think we both agreed that like maybe sort of aspects of his personality can be
Abrasive.
kind of abrasive, and he's admitted that. So I don't want to insult a man on the internet. Like,
well, neither one of them could be very charitable towards one another, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like I thought that was kind of a, but and I, and I will admit initially when I heard that interview, I was like, I wanted to say that the ecological system is BS because this guy's a douche. Like that was my first thought, and but and this okay, so this was kind of the mentality that I kept on finding attached to the ecological system. I literally watched probably 6 to 8 hours worth of videos and interviews on this, and I came across this comment, and I'm just going to read the whole thing. It's 2 paragraphs because I think this summed up what my issue was with the discussion and the way that the system is presented as a whole.
Can you shout out the username?
Yeah, the username is Ryan Thompson 3446.
What up, Ryan?
Yeah, and the comment was, "I honestly don't care if it is or not," and that's in reference to, is the ecological system does it work, or is it better than we'll say the more traditional system of like drilling? Mm-hmm. He said, "I honestly don't care if it is or not. It's clearly more productive and effective at producing the most skilled, well-rounded grappler. The only people I hear being super loud against are those who are too dumb to comprehend the science behind human movement and skill acquisition." Right? It continues. "Or those who are just antagonistic to anything that upsets their sycophantic?
Sycophantic?
Yeah. I don't even know what that means. I'm really showing my knuckle dragger right now.
I'm not sure I could give you a good definition.
Look it up. But they're using words like sycophantic. This is also frustrating to me. Sycophantic status quo.
Sycophantic, I think, means like following something zealously without questioning it.
Okay, perfect. So let me repeat this part. Antagonistic to anything that upsets their sycophantic status quo, and all I hear are fallacious non-arguments. Literally, Big Dan Doofus, Mr. ADCC Champ's best argument is, we win, we do drill, therefore we right, you wrong. Literal caveman thinking. Thank God science does not work that way, and honestly, if you have not done your due diligence to understand the ecological approach to skill acquisition, maybe read a couple papers, maybe a book or two. Big ask, apparently, for most. You really don't have a right to an opinion on it because you have no idea what it is. If you say, oh, that's just positional sparring, my God, man, are you lost? You okay, that pretty much summed up everyone that I came across that was like a big proponent, with a couple exceptions of interviews I watched that the guys were actually very clear and charitable to the system, but it just, when someone...
It's like the Reddit nerds are trying to take over Jiu-Jitsu.
And you just said, like sycophantic.
And we're on the side of the meatheads.
Yeah, dude. But being, like overly zealous about a new concept. Like, what more could you say about that guy that made that comment? Where it's like, it reads the same, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we could go forever, like...
And so I will. No, I'm just kidding.
Like, picking apart comments and I don't know, getting down in the dumps with this debate. But I think both of us sort of realize after time, like, well, he's definitely on to something. I have the feeling that he's maybe overstating his case a little bit. But let's try to steel man what Greg is saying, and then like I said, then we can kind of maybe get into our experience more. So, as I understand it, Greg is borrowing upon certain academic theories that are supposedly backed up by a lot of clinical research that uh, teach us about how people learn things, particularly how people learn behavior and learn movement. And that in jiu-jitsu, the sort of map that we have, the way that we often teach it is sort of as like a series of static positions, and then in each position there are different moves that you can do. And so you need to like build up a vocabulary of moves so that you can have a game, so that you have like an option in one of each of these positions. I mean, that's basically how I was taught to think about jiu-jitsu in the beginning. In fact, I'll shout out Stefan Kesting, who runs the website Grapple Arts, and he put out this PDF that I read like maybe like a month into jiu-jitsu called Roadmap to Jiu-Jitsu. And his idea was, okay, there's 8 basic positions. I've heard you could go as little as 4.
Sure.
You could go 8, maybe more than 8, but he says, closed guard, open guard, half guard, side control, knee mount,
north-south.
Mount. I think he said north-south is like a variation on side control.
Okay.
Mount, back, and turtle.
Okay.
And in each position, there's a bottom player and a top player. And in general, you can improve your position. And for at least one of the people, you could also attack submissions. Usually just one person. So
sure.
Like in the closed guard, we would generally say, well, the bottom person can attack submissions, but not the top person.
Okay.
So if you sort of do the math, that's 8 positions, top and bottom, and then generally you need about 2 moves of each type. So I think if you do all the math, it ends up being like roughly like 48 moves. So the theory was, well, it doesn't have to be like this move. You don't need to do the scissor sweep,
sure.
but you need to be able to sweep somebody from close guard a couple different ways at least. And so if you have about 48 moves, that's like, then you have something approaching a complete game in jiu-jitsu, and that's sort of like your goal to get a blue belt.
Yeah.
Let's say. But I think Greg is kind of rejecting that entire premise of viewing like static positions with and like sort of collecting moves. And, he's kind of saying, well, really, there are these more, I don't know, subtle or more general goals that you have, and that is comprising like 90%. I'm sort of putting words in his mouth, but that's comprising the majority of grappling. So really, like when you and I are playing and like we're in my half guard, it's not just like you doing your pass against me doing my sweep. There's like all this in between stuff, and that is really determining who wins the position. And then like the move sort of almost like spontaneously emerges out of like me being able to control your balance, or you being able to get chest to chest, and so he's designing these games basically as a coach to really teach these kind of things, which he considers to be the fundamental skills. And I think that's where he's got my attention.
Sure. No, I think that, because I think that is the strength of what the argument is, right? It's like, and I have learned this especially more now, right? Where, you get submitted with something, you're like, what the heck? Like, that's not a submission. That's not a traditional armbar. That's not whatever. Yeah. I remember having these thoughts like early on, where I'm like, yeah, he tapped me out, but it wasn't like a good technique. It was like, well, it made me tap out, and I was definitely getting my shoulder blown out, so something obviously worked. And that makes me think of what, Frank Mir did this interview, and this was kind of a big thing. I probably watched it 8 months to a year ago, where he said, a submission is just 3 things. It's a base, a lever, and a, what do you say? A base, a lever, and a pivot, right? A pivot, leverage point. so once I started thinking about submissions more like that, it gave me this new freedom where it's like, oh, I don't have to get to this specific position to finish an armbar. I don't have to get to what we would think about as a traditional armbar, right? Leg over the chest, leg over the face, and hugging that arm to your chest. It doesn't have to look that way, and I think that that is the strength of what Greg is saying. It almost seems like, because they're using all this terminology to describe what they're trying to do, but ultimately when you see it play out in like a seminar when he's describing these games, it does look like constrained positional sparring where it's like, hey, here's the rules, like if you're trying to teach them how to arm drag or whatever, it's like, hey, you cannot sub from the bottom, you need to try to access the back some way, and you can only take this kind of a grip, right? Yeah. So I don't, which I think that is the strong point, because ultimately something like a scissor sweep, right? A scissor sweep is taught a very specific way, but if you're able to pull principles out of that sweep, you can hit a bunch of different variations that might not even necessarily have some type of name to associate with it. Yeah. It just kind of works because you understand the principle of what it is to take out one leg of the, what do they say, like the four-legged table. If you take one leg out, okay, you're gonna knock it over that way. So I did find that to be compelling, but at the same time, it seems
well. Let me piggyback on that.
Go ahead.
Let me piggyback on that. So first of all, I would say it should be noted that the way he runs his class, as far as I can tell, does not use all of this sort of jargon. It's the way that he's understood his coaching method based off of like academic studies, which is fine. But I don't know. But he's not necessarily arguing that like every jiu-jitsu student needs to learn this sort of academic language that he's used.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to mention this thing because you're talking about like, oh, it doesn't have to look that way.
Sure.
And that was something interesting that he touched upon, is that a lot of times students are thinking about things aesthetically, and so you show a move, and then especially beginners are trying to make it look like how the coach did it. And the fact is, like, most people are kind of not that coordinated, and even if they are sort of traditionally coordinated, jiu-jitsu sort of forces you into weird movements that you're not used to. So it's almost like showing a dance move, and then people are like trying to copy the dance move.
Sure.
And so what Greg is saying, well, if you get them to think about what is their objective, then they're going to sort of naturally learn the skills necessary to achieve that. So if the objective is, get my knee to the floor, or the objective is keep your shoulders on the floor, the objective is, control one of your arms with two of my hands, or something like that, then I guess at least according to him, that that's going to sort of orient the student in the right direction, rather than trying to do the knee cut the way coach showed it and sort of think about all these details in the abstract and try to get it to look a certain way rather than to achieve a certain effect.
And I think, we don't have to stay on this for too much longer. We've been on it for about 15 minutes, but what kind of brought me around, like, you and I do this, and we kind of crack it, there's been jokes made about us kind of going off and not doing our own thing. It's still within the realm of what is being taught, right? But it's like, okay, today we're gonna work on this sweep from half guard and finding this underhook. And as you start to ramp up resistance and you start to throw in a little bit of your game into it, the stuff that we've been practicing in principle is still there for what we're doing during that drill time, but it might look a little bit different than what the two white belts in the corner are doing, just because I feel like we have this understanding. It's like, well, it's not going to be this static movement. Yeah. It's not, it's not. The deeper I get into this, the more it feels like I'm not memorizing a move set like I thought I was when I first started. I'm really just playing around with these principles and trying to apply them in real time, right? Yeah. Which is kind of a different thing than, like you said move collecting earlier on, like just collecting techniques. And it's like, like
Pokemon.
Yeah, exactly, dude. Got to catch them all. But once I started to realize like, okay, this isn't going to look exactly like this during a live roll or when I'm being met with some amount of resistance, it kind of it led to this acceptance that it's not going to look super pretty. And if you wanted it to look super pretty, you could go to a Japanese jiu-jitsu school where that's all they're doing is they have a really cooperative partner, and the moves look super textbook. They look like something you would see out of footage from the early 1900s in Japan, right?
Yeah.
Of these guys going over stuff. So yeah, I mean, at the end of it,
It's good if you want to make a movie with cool fight scenes.
that's for sure. Yeah, real violence doesn't actually look that pretty oftentimes, even if it's like.
But that's one of the best arguments, I think, to keep traditional martial arts alive, so we can have
awesome
sick,
movies,
sick fight scenes.
So Michael Jai White can go out there and crack skulls. But yeah, so I guess to put a bow on it, initially watching that interview, I didn't want to agree or like any of it because it wasn't the message; it was the messenger who was like. I just found him so abrasive that, like, okay, this guy's just throwing out scientific stuff, and like, but he's repackaging stuff that it seemed to me that he was trying to explain intricacies that I didn't necessarily think were that important to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Not for the layman or even necessarily the practitioner, maybe the coach and the teacher, but for the guy that's just trying to do it, it's like, I just want to know what works. I don't need to know what synapses are firing in order to achieve learning.
I think ultimately, I was thinking about this a lot. I think really coaching and teaching in general, and I should mention that like my profession is a teacher. I teach math, and I've taught music lessons, and I coach kids jiu-jitsu classes. So I sort of have experience teaching in a few different areas. But really, ultimately, I just think it comes down to some level of expertise is a prerequisite, but you could be really good at something and not very good at teaching it.
That's very
true.
But
I think it really has to do with like the coach's relationship with their students and just sort of being attentive to like what are the problems that we're running into, and just sort of paying attention to the training, pay attention to the competition, and communicating clearly. And I don't know, there's lots of things, not giving people too much. And you're talking about like us maybe kind of improvising a lot off of what coach is showing.
Yeah.
And, I think
improvising is a good word to make us not look like clowns.
I think our coach is supportive of that, and I think a good coach should like be okay with that, especially with more experienced students. But yeah, I want to sort of move away from this debate. I think probably we will end up circling back to this like later in the podcast, because it's very hot right now, and I think it's piqued both of our interests. And I've actually begun experimenting with this approach a lot in kids classes. So maybe we'll have more to say about it in a few months. But do you have any more
I
to
just
say?
wanted to say, like, when I was like a training officer for a really short time when I was with the police department, and I think I had like 3 students, right? 3 full-time students. And what I had learned is like people learn differently. Like people, or even if maybe scientifically that's not true, but even if they perceive themselves as someone who learns better when they're given some type of verbal instruction, and then they're allowed to go hands-on versus like, okay, I just need to get in there and try to do it, and then the lessons will kind of like present themselves. So I think that's another component to it, where I don't think maybe there are what you would say is an invariable when it comes to adult learning. Invariant. Thank you. But it does seem to me that people are just different. The way that they learn is different, and I'm now that we're moving on to the next topic, I think we're actually going to be able to maybe see some differences in the way that you and I learned best, or when the times that we saw our jiu-jitsu progressing, just based on the way we were training or what we were choosing to focus on. I don't think it's going to be identical for the both of us, or I could be totally wrong and it's going to be exactly that.
Well, I agree, and I think that's sort of why I think like the coach's relationship with the student is sort of key to the whole thing.
Sure.
But I think there's also a lot that like because we're not like full-time athletes, I think there's a lot about like our personal choices of both training and lifestyle and study that can make a big difference one way or the other. And that's sort of more where I'd like to take the rest of our time. But from the way I see it, I think one of the reasons that this debate was interesting is because it highlighted this sort of bigger dilemma that I think so many people experience. And there's one training partner of ours, former training partner, I won't mention by name, but this is just, I think of him as an example, but the coach shows a move, and then, like I said, it's like you're trying to get all these details right. And this particular person, I'll just use it as an example. Like, I just remember, like, when drilling would be like, okay, so I have to get the underhook, and then I have to have this hand block the crossface, and then and he would talk himself through and then he would be hard on himself about like getting every detail right.
I'm really trying to figure out who you're talking about right now.
Well,
anyway,
it doesn't matter. It's
sure.
Joey Whitebelt.
Yeah, copy.
and then when he would roll, it's like he would just death grip you and just try to grab you as hard as he could, and he's like grunting, and then he's like totally exhausted at the end of the roll, and then he's like complaining like, yeah, it's like I'm just not like, I don't remember the moves that we learn in class when I'm rolling it. And I think that this is sort of the big problem, and I sort of come up with a theory of my own to explain this.
Yes.
And I think that there's sort of two. We could think of it like a square or like a compass, right? And there's two axes.
Okay.
And the one axis is variability, and the other axis is intensity.
Sure.
Okay. And so what happens when you're drilling like that is it's low variability and low intensity. In other words, you know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to sit there in half guard, and I'm going to knee slice. For some reason, knee slice is always like the example people use.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a ubiquitous pass, right?
Okay, so, and then when we roll, it's high variability and high intensities. And what I mean by that is high variability. It's really there's 1,000 different things that can happen.
Yes,
because
you're no longer locked.
I mean, rolling is a kind of constraint-based game. It's like we agree not to like punch or headbutt or like bite each other.
Sure.
But then the first person to tap loses.
Yes.
But there's like so many ways to get there. We could wrestle for 3 minutes. I could pull guard. I could try to leg lock you. You could try to take my back and show, so many different things can happen. And I think it feels very overwhelming for the beginner. And then also the intensity levels is so different.
Yeah.
And so I think so many people struggle with this, and I think like you need to sort of bridge that gap. And I would really recommend to people like, you got to pick up the pace in your drilling.
Yeah.
So like you want to think of the class as a warm up in a sense to rolling. So you should like be more and more as you're going through the drill, like picking up the intensity so that it feels more like a fight, and getting more resistance from your partner, and picking up the speed and not obsessing. You're not going to get every detail. Like, I'll say this, I still learn like details of what we would consider like basic moves like all the time, and I've been doing this years, and I'm obsessed with study and stuff.
Yeah.
But you'll still will pick up like, oh, if you grip it this way, you have like more leverage to do with this or whatever. So like, stop worrying about getting all the details right. Start worrying about getting the feel of executing that movement with a higher intensity.
Yeah.
And that's going to help you a lot. And then the other end of that is when you roll, you can dial down the intensity.
Sure.
Depending on the training partner.
Yep.
But like, if you roll with Aaron or me, and you're not trying to like take our head off, then we will, and and you're less experienced, then we will like
keep it playful.
Yeah, we will reciprocate.
Sure.
That. And so,
and if you try to take our heads off, I'm gonna take yours off first. No, no. Even like we talked about this last podcast, I have a hard time with that. But I think
me too,
but it's I think that's a very good point. I think that was actually that was very like kind of a poignant theory because, but I think that's when it comes down to like understanding principles of what we're going over here, off balancing and taking away their base, taking away taking away some type of post, any of this kind of thing. Yeah, you should continue because that's just like that's I have to think about that for a second.
I'll talk about it a little bit more. I mean, I
Sure.
just came up with this the other day.
Okay.
And thinking about this, but so we could also think about high intensity, low variability.
Yeah.
So that would be like more like a positional drill. So you start at mount and I'm trying to escape and you're trying to head and arm choke me.
Sure.
Or something like that. So now it's low variability because we know there's only a couple possibilities of what can happen, but it's high intensity, so it feels like a fight. And we can also have high variability, low intensity, which is like what people call flow rolling.
Sure.
Where you're really slowing things down and not like squeezing the crap. You're taking the pressure off a lot of these positions so that it allows the person's nerves to calm and they can think their way through different positions, but they're getting used to just like seeing something and moving. And really, Jiu-Jitsu ultimately is a feel-based game. And it seems very and it is very complicated, but people who have more experience, like if you're someone with less experience and you're trying to figure out how do I get to blue belt, how do I get to purple belt, like those guys, especially the guys that like you look at and they just seem really smooth and efficient with what they're doing, they're not thinking about the role like a chess game. It's really a feel thing.
Sure.
And I think that's a big change of mentality. Like so for example, like let's say I wrestle up on an underhook out of half guard. The way I thought about this as a white belt was like, okay, well first I'm gonna get to my knees and then try to wrestle you down, and then if you push back into me, then I'll try to roll you back over.
Yep.
And then if you base on the ground, then I'll try to pop my head out and take your back. And I sort of thought about it like this chess match. But in reality, it's like there are these sort of variables at play.
Sure.
Right? It's like if you're too open, if you leave enough space, I can take your back. If you're off balance, I can wrestle you down. If you're off balance the other way, I can roll you. And then it really becomes like, I don't know, just this dynamic.
Well, it's fluid.
Game. Yeah, it's not turn-based.
It's not turn-based.
It's not like chess where it's turn-based. It's this fluid game of, and you understand the game and I understand the game. So it's not about who has more knowledge.
Yeah.
It's just who can sort of exploit the dynamics at play. And so when you start to think that way and start to feel the position and you can sort of like feel the person's balance, I think it's a real game changer.
Well, it starts to because because when you talk about it that way, it's not to say that these moves and these positions and these submissions that are really pretty and technically proper. Greg would hate that I would say proper even, but that can manifest still, right? You're flowing through this grappling session with somebody, and then you find yourself in a position of a traditional armbar. But the way that you got there wasn't this, like you said, turn-based. It wasn't this grip, pull, throw the leg over the face, hug the arm, sit back. It doesn't necessarily feel that way. It's not a... I almost don't know how to articulate it because the move can look pretty. You can get into these positions where you're finishing submissions that look textbook.
Yeah.
But it's not by way of this step-by-step progression of, okay, this grip, this sweep, this movement, underhook here. It's not like paint by the numbers. Like you were talking about the ex-partner who used to be so obsessed with like, okay, so now I take this underhook here, now I have to grab this, and being super detail oriented. Like those details, you're not necessarily thinking about them once you get to that point, because you just understand based on principle. Once he turns here, I'll have access to the back. I can slip a hook in. If he turns over towards me, and if I can go back to a combat base, I can throw my legs out, whatever it might be. And so I think that's I feel like as a purple belt, I'm just now appreciating that, or maybe noticing that that's what's going on, versus like, but he told me to do the armbar, I needed to do this,
right?
And it's like, yeah, well, that's true, but like you said, there's all these little intricacies and variables that you can't really teach. You have to feel for yourself to know when it's time to hit this grip or switch here, or move your weight onto this hip instead.
Yeah.
And
I think that's the difference between, when a move is shown in class, there's a difference between like beginners and more intermediate or advanced people. Is the beginners are thinking about it like, okay, I have to do this, 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 and this, and this. Whereas when you're more advanced, you kind of put yourself in the position, even if you're not doing it perfectly the way the coach showed, quote unquote perfectly, and then you're like, okay, how does this feel? And then I might say to you, like, does it feel like you could roll me? Like, you feel like you could reverse me out of this position?
Sure.
Oh, okay, well that means my base. So you develop this sort of intuition.
Yeah.
And I would also say, even just like watching a move, like watching somebody do a move, you have like an intuition of like how and why that works.
Sure.
And a lot of times, like, why it might not work.
Yeah,
although you can be wrong.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like, you get a better bullshit detector for like crazy Instagram moves.
Well, yeah, no kidding. Well, what I wrote in my notes is that it's different competition because I feel like you're not thinking as much, but my internal monologue changed at some point during my rolls, right? Where before it was like, okay, I need to get this frame on the neck. I need a frame on the hip. I need to get to a hip. I need to shrimp and put a knee shield in. And now there is that component to it, but it's noticing way more subtle things versus like these big grand ideas. And it's I don't know why it takes so long to understand that. Maybe it's because just the nature of how we train, where it is very much, I mean, drilling is kind of a paint by the numbers deal, especially when you're first learning. Like, okay, hand on the hip here, okay, grab the tricep here, and this is how you're going to accomplish getting to this position. But when you have that switch kind of flips, and you're like, oh, okay, this isn't. It's almost like you discover you can't understand it unless you've been there, sort of a thing. So when I hear guys like Darian or even Coach Chris, like when they talk about getting their black belt and that feeling of like, okay, now I'm restarting,
right,
to some degree. And you don't really understand that as a white belt. It's like, what do you mean restarting? Like, you already you understand jiu-jitsu, you know how to do everything. But you don't understand that when you're a new guy coming in. And then as you get, into higher promotions and higher levels of it, you're like, oh my gosh, okay, I understand what they were trying to tell me. I just didn't have enough information in front of me and experience in front of me to be able to really grasp what they were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At least that's what I kind of take away from that.
Yeah, that is funny. You hear people say that a lot, or you hear black belts say that a lot, and I guess you and I only have maybe like an inkling of what they mean. But
sure, but you do feel that because at blue belt you're like, I'm really starting to understand jiu-jitsu. That's what I felt like.
Yeah.
Right. I'm really starting to understand this. I'm understanding what I need to be doing, and
yeah.
And then you become a purple belt, and for me it was like, okay, maybe now your understanding changes completely. Again, like even the, okay, it's not paint by the numbers. My monologue has changed. I'm looking for way subtler things.
Yeah.
Like,
I know what you mean.
Body positioning. I'm not looking for these specific grips necessarily. I'm just trying to apply these principles that I've kind of honed through a bunch of different moves and a bunch of like drilling a bunch of different techniques and sweeps for that feel. That's more or less what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, and like I was saying, it's, the sort of classical way to think about it is like, okay, there's these positions, and you could start simply. You could say, okay, overall, there's like the simplest way I've heard it put, and the way I tell my kids a lot is like, okay, there's guard, there's side control, there's mount, and there's the back.
Sure.
So, and you want to have, like I'll tell my kids, well, you want to have like one move from the top and the bottom, at least.
Yeah.
And then like it gets more complicated. At a certain point, you realize, well, you really need two moves at least, and you to be able to chain things together. And then you realize there's like way more positions. You got to learn all these different guards, and then like leg lock positions, and all different types of pins. Different variations on side control and so on. And it just sort of seems overwhelming. Although I guess it's fun for a person like me because it sort of does feel like you're collecting Pokemon, like I said.
No, I get that.
And you're sort of like filling up your bag of tricks.
Do you ever have stuff that you go to routinely that you wouldn't be able to teach?
Yes. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Let me come back to that.
Okay, yeah, totally.
But then like you're saying, I think like around like mid-level blue belt into purple belt, you do start to think about it in a much different way, and you realize that like there's all this space in between what we think of as those positions.
Sure.
And it's really, in a sense, like I don't want to say there's no such thing as half guard. That's like just pretentious.
Yeah.
But the boundaries of like half guard are kind of fuzzy.
That's a good way to put it.
And there's all these sort of different levels of half guard, and there's like, I would rather be in side control with strong frames than be in half guard where you're like totally smashing me with like chest to chest. So you, like you're saying, you sort of realize that your original way of thinking about it was not accurate, and I think a lot of people have realized this, but maybe it's just been assumed, but it's just sort of the way it is, but we need to teach moves, so we give, and I think a lot of disciplines are like this, it's like you have to give beginners a framework.
Like more defined boundaries, right?
Yeah. It's like, I think about this like music, like, the way I teach a beginner in guitar, piano, is like just so that I can start to get them playing music.
Sure.
But it's, a good musician is like, they're sort of free from all these constraints.
Sure.
And I think Jiu-Jitsu's got very, very similar in that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And so I don't know, it's just interesting is like to think, well, maybe we don't exactly have to teach it that way so much.
Sure.
In terms of like, or we can maybe discourage beginners from thinking about, okay, there's this position and you're trying to do this, but then in this position you're trying to do this, and so on, and it just sort of they feel like, well, I've only been to 5 classes, so I only know like these 3 positions, but like they can't even do those moves against anybody decent anyways.
Sure.
So, maybe it's better to just teach them to grip fight, or like.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the answer is to that. I really don't, because I think you do need to give them the framework.
Yeah.
But you do see that frustration when you're like, hey, this is what you want. This is what you're doing right now during this roll. You need to not do this. Don't hug my head when I'm on side control. Like, try to establish some type of frame. And then I see this sometimes where it's like, okay, now I'm past that frame. And there's like this, not bewilderment, but almost a frustration where it's like, okay, but you just said if I did this frame. I was like, yeah, but I've seen that frame 10,000 times, so I know how to get past it.
Yeah.
But foundationally, you should understand, don't hug my head and put this frame in here.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I would say this gets into something also interesting, is like, how should we use our open mat time? So, and this gets into like how we can help to get ourselves to get better.
Sure.
And I would say a couple thoughts come to mind. One thing is, I think it really is helpful to like find mentors.
I agree.
And I think that like there's certain higher belts that I gravitated towards because I liked their game or just personality wise we got along
Sure.
or whatever. And they were very generous in helping me with things and ask questions. But also, like we've been saying, try not to focus so much on details. Like, try to focus on like big picture stuff, and be self-critical in terms of like, um, what are the sort of big picture problems that you're running into over and over again. And you probably are not going to be able to say that without somebody's help at
Sure.
first because it's just like a whirlwind of chaos.
Sure.
Um, and also pay it forward as you come up the ranks. It's good to take people under your wing to keep that tradition going. But you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, well, when it comes to open mat, I think it changes over time, right? Like,
but about like mentorship specifically.
Mentorship. Well, I would say the best thing you could do when it comes to mentorship is find, like, I have a Cody, and for me, like when I start, you got promoted what 2 years before?
I don't know if
got
I
my
could be
purple
your
belt?
mentor if you routinely kick my ass.
Yeah, but the thing is, you have a knack for studying and being able to explain things that I am not picking up on.
A lot of good it does me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just yeah. And I can totally understand that, but if someone were to ask me, I would 100%. I could beat you 10 out of 10 times, and I would concede that you have a deeper understanding of jiu-jitsu than I do. That's how I feel.
Oh well.
And so
thanks. I
yeah,
guess.
well, but the reason that I kind of said, like, as far as mentors, like, there's some guys that have a knack for something that maybe you lack. And for me, I like the physicality of jiu-jitsu. I do like the intellectual pursuit to a certain degree, but it doesn't light my fire as much as going to war at an open mat, right? So
Yeah.
when we train together and you either see me do something or you bring something into the role where you're like, hey, I want to work on something, or like, hey, you're doing this, I saw this thing, maybe you should like just play around with this. And sometimes it's like, it was so significant that's like, okay, now I haven't stopped doing that.
Nice.
Little things like that. So I think, like, when it comes to finding a mentor, find either someone that does something well that you want to do well, right? Like you were talking about respecting someone's game, or finding someone. I don't know. I think that maybe personality is a huge component of that.
Yeah.
Maybe someone with similar goals as well.
Yeah.
Um,
I think so. We talked about this in our first episode a little bit, but like you sort of have a style that naturally emerges out of
sure.
the way you move and the way that you think, and so it's good not to. You don't want to decide on what your game is going to be too early.
Yeah.
You don't want to say like, oh,
I'm going to be an armbar guy.
I'm a closed guard guy or whatever. Yeah. But it is helpful to, like I said, gravitate towards higher belts whose games like it sort of speaks to you. Like I can think of a couple guys where it was like I like the way that guy rolls.
Totally.
Because he's smooth and he can really control his level of resistance, and he's comfortable top and bottom. And once I realized that like closed guard is a lot harder than I thought it was, I started to gravitate to butterfly guard.
Sure.
He had like one of the best butterfly games ever that I've trained against.
Yeah.
And so I do think it is helpful to gravitate towards those people, and like people tend to specialize in different positions. And
is there a reason that you brought up open mat specifically to like how you would find optimize your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we probably both fall into this where like you show up to open mat and you're like, oh, tough room tonight, and then like you just go round after round after round after round. Some of them might be easier because the skill level is really different, or because it's like like Darian and I often like to sort of be more playful and not try to kill each other.
Sure.
Other roles are hard. And then and I think it is good to like get those intense role and like, get a look at everybody. But it sort of becomes this like addictive thing, and I think that if we would take some of that time and be more conscious about our training, especially for beginners, I would say, I think that you could get a lot more out of your open mat time and just feel less frustrated and less physically beat up and I think if it helps any of you, like, please let me know, but I think this sort of variability intensity thing could be useful. Like, if you find like, well, I'm just always getting my guard pass, well, like, find somebody that you can work with and be like, hey, try to pass my guard, and let's try not to kill each other, and you can get like a little less intensity, a much lower variability. And I just think that kind of sort of bridging the gap between slowly drilling, like we talked about
sure
earlier, like methodically drilling against a passive opponent, and then like two white belts trying to kill each other.
Yep.
You got to sort of find that in between to sort of bridge the gap, and then one day you will be able to put all those skills together in an intense free for all round. But
yeah, I mean, once you get more, you get deeper into the journey of jiu-jitsu, it's almost like, at least for me, like my goals at open mat changed. Like when early on, it was like go in there and get hard rounds, which I think is, I don't think very many things can replace getting in hard rounds. I know that especially, I think early on, that's an important thing to like understand what the intensity is like
100%.
And what it feels like to get crushed.
And even as you go on later, you don't want to sort of fall into the trap of always playing the game.
Sure.
You want to feel like those young athletic guys like trying to kill you.
Yeah, for sure.
And having to like meet that intensity.
Yeah, like when I go to open mat now, I usually have a couple things in mind, right? If we got space to stand, I have a takedown that I go in there that I'm going to try and hit this. Like I'm not going to take anyone down unless I can establish this takedown. And I'll try to work my way into a position where I can hit that. And then when we're on the ground, I'm going to get on top. I've no sub attempts from the bottom. And if I'm on the bottom, I'm not going to play there. I'm going to try and sweep and get on top. When I'm on top, I'm going to go for arm bars. That's the only sub I have today. Mm-hmm. And I think that has been... But you can't... The issue with being at that lower level is you're not going to be able to make that decision as easily as someone who has the experience, right?
But you could just, like, focus on mount escape. I mean, you're sort of forced to.
Yeah. Just survive. That might be the way.
But yeah, I mean, I first of all, I will say you are probably better at that than me.
Sure.
Like that sort of focused rolling. I always sort of tell myself I'm gonna be like that, but then I don't know. I lose focus in the rounds, or maybe I'm just not as able to impose my will on people as you are. But yeah, I think for beginners that's harder, and I think like the kind of stuff that I'm talking about is gonna be more fruitful for a lot of those people. Is like
it's more accessible for
find other white belts, or maybe find a blue belt or a purple belt who's friendly and is like willing to work with you, and like talk to them and be like, especially somebody who shares your frustration. Maybe it's like, dude, I'm just always getting killed, and like I feel like I'm not getting that much better. It's like, hey, let's take 3 rounds, 4 rounds, every Saturday open mat, and we're going to just work on stuff and play these games and not try to kill each other. So that would be my recommendation for white belts that are struggling with this, is like think about like bridging the gap in variability and intensity between like learning a move and practicing it over and over again, and then like a hard round. So you got to sort of try to work your way in both directions. and get some experience and like we were saying earlier, like get a sense of the feel. What is the feel of these positions?
Sure.
What is the what am I trying to feel? You should be able to do jiu-jitsu with your eyes closed. Like it's not something that you analyze in the moment. I think analysis comes in between your trainings if you're that sort of a person.
To close this out, we're coming up on our hour mark, and I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here to a certain degree because I've been kind of thinking about this. I mean, it just naturally was on my mind just based on the topic. What are 3 things, like if you had someone, you didn't know anything about them, they're starting jiu-jitsu, what are 3 things that you would tell them right off the bat that are like, they can be super specific, they can be a little bit more meta?
Yeah. I mean, one thing is I gotta kind of feel how they roll.
Are you about to say it depends? Because
Yeah. But I mean, things that I tell people on their first day, like, I would say most people are way too intense.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they'll respond, they're like, "Oh man, well I'm just trying to hang with you," and like, they don't realize that like
you can't.
The aggression, yeah. You can't. But I also feel like I don't want to tell them that. It's like they need to figure that out on their own.
Sure.
But yeah, I will say, when you train with higher belts, most of them will match your level of intensity. Okay.
Sure.
And like I've been talking about, you're much more likely to learn at a sort of a medium intensity, whatever that means. And you really need to focus on getting better. So I think a lot of times beginners define success in their role first by tapping people, then they realize they can't tap anybody.
Sure.
Maybe they can tap the other guy on his first day that they have like 40 pounds on.
Yes.
But, you don't need martial arts at all to dominate an untrained person who's much smaller than you.
Yeah, smaller and weaker person. That's just bullying, I think, is what the technical term is.
But, or they'll define it like in terms of like not tapping.
Sure.
But, that can be deceptive because it's like, I might have been able to break your arm just now.
Now you're out for 2 weeks.
And I chose not to because I don't want to break your arm.
Oh.
And you just like used this huge burst of energy to get on. So like, you shouldn't think of those things as a success. So like, don't be super intense. Sort of corollary to that is, be willing to tap and don't think of tapping as a failure, especially at an early level.
Sure.
And sort of also along with that is just focus on learning and sort of long-term, like, what is your long-term goals?
Yeah, well, that's a common one. That's what I was going to say that as well.
And I would say also try to spend an equal amount of time on top and on bottom. Gotcha. Most people are going to want to be on top all the time. Some people may gravitate. Some people have maybe a kind of a passive nature. And I don't mean that as a slight. I was like that at first.
Yeah, I started I would spend most of my time on my back.
Yeah. But yeah, if you're one of those people, look for your opportunities to get on top and like come on top aggressively. And if you're meathead who thinks it's gay to like be on your back, like either don't train jiu-jitsu or just get over that and spend some time on the bottom, because you don't always have a choice is the thing. It's like somebody might put you on your back and then you're uncomfortable there and then you don't know anything. And so those are 3 things.
Yeah, I think those are good. What I was gonna say, mine are gonna be so much less like, mine are a little bit specific, but the first thing I was going to say is understand your goals, because that's what's going to drive the rest of your the rest of your journey, right? Are you in here just to get in shape? Are you in here because you want to understand like street defense and you want to be able to protect yourself? Or you're in here because you want to be a competitor? Do you want to go into MMA? Because that can lead to very different ways of training and very different ways of focusing on the art. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, and I think that this is kind of overlooked because, especially the guys that just want to train jiu-jitsu, but there is a significant difference between guys who have some type of strength and mobility program that they're working outside of the gym and the guys that don't.
Yeah.
Because there can be people there at the gym that have way more skill and prowess in jiu-jitsu, and I bring up Liam again, but that guy was such a problem to deal with because he was so athletic and fit and strong because he was maintaining outside of the gym, he was maintaining a fitness level and he had a program that he was working. And the third thing I would say, and I wish I would have done this when I had first started, was really understanding the basic positions. Like just knowing guard, here's the basic tenets of guard. Here's side control. Here's the basic tenets of pinning from that position. Mount. Here's the things that I need to understand about mount. And understanding terminology so that when someone's explaining something to you, you already have a Rolodex in your head of what they're talking about. And that, again, that's like really simplistic. It's not as, I would say, as maybe robust and deep as the things that you were talking about. But if I was to tell someone something like, hey, how do you want to be, or, if you want to be successful and have a good time, and number 4 would be like continue to have fun with it because we continue to come back because it's fun. Jiu-jitsu is fun, and but yeah, I think that those things.
Well, how come you get 4?
Yeah,
I want to. Okay, my fourth one.
I thought 4 was going to be a common. Yeah, we have no time for your 4th one. But I just knew that would be a common, something common because having fun is a lot of it.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're still having fun because the moment you stop having fun, maybe not the moment because there's those days where you get your butt kicked, but you want to continue to keep things fresh and make things fun for yourself. So however you achieve that, just make that happen.
Well, to piggyback on that, you just got to accept the peaks and valleys of the experience of getting better at jiu-jitsu and not like, take the ass kickings as they come, take the victories. What did Conor McGregor say that one time? Be humble in victory.
Who the fuck is this guy?
Gracious in defeat.
Oh, that's right. That sounds better.
So anyway, there's I think we'll wrap up episode 2. I think once again we've posed an interesting question and utterly failed to answer it comprehensively over the course of an hour, but we appreciate you guys that are listening for bearing with us as we figure this thing out, but I'm having a blast doing this.
Yeah, and if you have any feedback for us, like if you think the episode should be shorter or there's topics you guys want us to hit, we actually have an Instagram and an email that you guys can reach out to us. The Instagram is the Grappler's Dilemma Podcast, and we have a Gmail email, thegrapplersdilemma@gmail.com. So if you guys have anything that you'd like to share as far as your journey or any type of critique or suggestion about the show, it would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys.
Us.